This show is for anyone who wants to take charge of their health journey and thrive beyond the doctor's office. Learn how to navigate the healthcare system and discover solutions that work for your life. Hear from diverse voices as we explore what matters most. My name is Dr. Bayo, and welcome to Beyond Clinical Walls. You know that moment when life hits you so hard and you're forced to completely reinvent yourself? Today's guest went from closing billion-dollar deals on Wall Street to building something that would change how we think about mental health forever. And it all started with a personal crisis that made her question everything. Welcome to Beyond Clinical Walls. I'm Dr. Bayo, and this is where we explore the stories that shape healthcare beyond the exam room. Today, I'm joined by Samantha Trotman Burman, Harvard MBA turned mental health innovator. As the CEO of StoryCatch Partners, she's on a mission to revolutionize mental health support through the power of storytelling. But before we dive into her incredible journey from investment banker to healthcare changemaker, let me ask you this. What if a key component of helping our mental health crisis has been right in front of us all along? Welcome, Samantha. And with every one of my podcasts, I always like to ask my guests why you do what you do.
Well, thank you, Dr. Bio, and thank you so much for that introduction. It's always nice to hear your own background reflected back to you. It makes me think about that differently. So, the reason that I'm here and the reason I get up every day and do what I do is because I am driven to create a sustainable business that helps people with the ambiguity of being human. So the parts of that sentence, which is a very big sentence, is driven by my business background and my desire to build something in this business that far outlives me. And I'll sometimes say that more simply by saying that I don't want to die ordinary. And that's not because I want to be known necessarily for me, but I want the work that I'm doing now and the business that's being created to really impact as many people as possible in a positive way. That's the business part of that. The ambiguity of being human part is this journey of life, pretty much no matter how you come at it, where you're from, how you grew up, which country you're in. We all live with this knowledge that we're not here forever. And so I call that the ambiguity of being human, in that we know that to be true, but oftentimes we spend a lot of time trying to distract ourselves. And equally, it's that balance, because you can't live every day as if it's your last, or it's very hard to do that and be efficient and effective. But you also, I think, oftentimes can get into the point where you get distracted by these other things and don't recognize the fragility, but also the beauty of life. So that sounds like it's a long way from mental health. And the reason that I came to the conclusion that what I was really doing was helping people understand and navigate that ambiguity of being human is because, as Joseph Campbell would say in his hero's journey, he would say that there's usually a call to adventure. And my call to adventure, I had a number of them as I was growing up and developing into adulthood, but I chose to ignore those. But the ones that I could not ignore were the calls to adventure around my children and them struggling primarily with anxiety, but to the point of really having a hard time having a life worth living. And so that was the reason that I started to learn a lot more about what mental well-being meant to me and to my family, and then started to understand the interpersonal relationships and all of that. And notwithstanding the fact that I think we need a lot more clinicians like you in the world, we also, I think, need the stakeholders, as I call them. I'm not a huge fan of the word caregiver necessarily, but I think there are a lot of stakeholders that care about people that are struggling with a lack of optimization of mental well-being. And I think that those stakeholders also need support, and they need education, and they need empathy. And so about 12 years ago, when I was really struggling with how to parent four children that had different levels of anxiety, I felt very lonely. I felt like there was not much in the way of guidance of how to navigate the system and to find the kinds of care that I might need for my kids. And I found that there were very few, even well-meaning friends and family members that really understood what I was going through. And so that's why I really love one of the models that I've created is a professional peer model that we use to support family members that have other family members that are struggling. And what I like about that is that it's a very well proven model through the addiction model, with the sponsors being there to really lift other people up that are going through similar problems. And I think that the way of offering that empathy, as Teddy Roosevelt would say, when you're face down in the arena, right? That's when you really know that you're trying your best. But I also think of that as when you're face down in the arena, that's where judgment goes totally out the window. And so I have collected together an environment and a network of people that have been through a lot of different situations that have caused them to struggle and really rethink the way that they parent, the way that they are a human being, the way that they show up for their relationships, whether it's at work or personally. It's a really beautiful thing to see how that can be a healing process where you share your own story. I loved what you said in the introduction about stories matter. So sharing my own individual story oftentimes gives people permission to share their stories back. Then you start to build a little bit of a community. And then the digital research part of my business actually comes back around and starts helping us prove out some of the evidence that could bring about systemic change in how care is provided to people that are struggling.
First, I just want to say thank you for even sharing your drive, your mission of why you do what you do. And when people have the opportunity to hear that, it really allows them to paint a picture of why you are driven for this mission, why you are invested or a stakeholder in this based on personal and professional, but that blend together to be able to create something that can help others, as you mentioned, beyond yourself, beyond when are no longer living. That is a powerful thing to be able to pass on to others and be able to make change within the healthcare system and all of the areas that we are struggling. And mental health, is one of those at the forefront. When we talk about mental well being and creating that collective space, which is what you're doing right now, what are some of the learnings that you have seen from just the start of this?
Yes, thank you. That's a great question. I think that a number of the things that I've learned, one of them I think is that there's really a sense of nuance in a lot of this. So we're such complex creatures in our uniqueness, but also in our similarity. And that's really a dialectic. And a lot of people have heard of dialectic behavior therapy, especially in your profession. And what I like about that is it's really challenging this human bias towards categorization and bucketing, whether it's topics or people. So you turn right or you turn left, you see things as black or white, you see things in those stark colors. And I'm always inviting people into the murky middle. So the murky middle is that we all have very, very significant similarities, but also significant differences. And I think that's one of the reasons why one size does not fit all. And when I talk about the work that I'm doing in mental well-being, oftentimes people will say, well, that's just such a big topic. What could you possibly do to move the needle? What could you possibly do to make change? And I love those kinds of challenges because it's sort of bulletin board material for me, where I say, you know what? I think it is a really complex set of issues, and there is no one message that is going to suit somebody. But I do think that we can learn a lot from telling each other the stories, because I think that's where, first of all, allowing somebody listening is the gift, right? So we don't do that enough in today's modern society, where it really is a gift to sit with somebody and without judgment and without interrupting and without trying to fix it, You're just listening to what they have to say. And just being seen and heard in that way is something that causes human connection, where I sometimes will describe it as something magical often happens. And so the magic moments that I have seen and experienced are in feeling that connection. Somebody feels like they can share with you something that they may have not shared before. And as we often talk about, shame really has no place, or fear feels very different when it's out in the open in a safe way. And I think I've seen that over and over again. And the interesting part is that I've also seen it happen in very different forums. So sometimes people respond to music, sometimes people respond to video, to audio, to podcasts. We all as human beings tend to learn a little bit differently. But I think the biggest thing that I've learned is that anecdotes, stories have healing power, but there's also information in there. And I think that the reason that I'm very proud of the business model that I've formed is that we are trying to look at that and understand how that can lead to bigger volume, if you will, or to amplify some of those single stories, which we acknowledge as being unique in their stories, but having them grow in their number, we can amplify them to then really see some patterns that could lead to that systemic change. So I guess in short, I think my biggest learning is efficiency is not our friend. Because I think that if we sit down and really do that listening part, that's often where much of the magic happens.
I agree. Listening is underrated, and storytelling is a part of that because there's something to be said about when you hear someone's story, your perception or your bias or anything that you are coming into the conversation seems to go to the wayside because all of a sudden you are hearing this person's personal journey. And that can really reshape or break down barriers or notions that you had about a specific topic, an idea, anything. I love that you use the word magical because stories are magical. When you go back into childhood, how when we would hear stories, how that was a fantasy, it was a way to escape, but also learn at the same time. And if that story is rooted in a lived experience, my goodness, the amount of learnings and opportunities that you can take in passively and actively, that is a real opportunity to produce change. And that's what you're doing. And I love it because that's something that I utilize as well in healthcare and delivery, and listening, of course, is number one as the starting point. My next question, Samantha, is as we talk about the work that you're doing, the model that you've developed, I would love to learn more about the work that you're doing with rare diseases and clinical studies. Are you able to share more about that and the things that you've been able to really discover?
Yes, absolutely. It's interesting because part of the business model with it, that's the engine that is part of Storycatch Partners, is this idea that in order to gain that systemic change, that there's the passion that comes from the storytelling and the story hearing and the community that can be built. But I'm not satisfied with that until we can start having actionable data around different either causes or potential solutions to misunderstood or poorly understood problem areas. That's how we use the process of observational research and clinical trials to find answers to some of those unanswered problems. Now, that doesn't often come up when you are looking at special interest groups, when you are looking at not-for-profits and so forth. And I'm a big fan of not-for-profits because often that's where a lot of passion is collected together and there can be a lot of amplifying of that passion, which is excellent. But again, back to my idea of the business model being sustainable over generations and generations, that gets back to understanding the business model and how money flows in the system, because money and understanding the money flow is often the way that you can have change come about. And so sometimes I'll talk about, as a byline to the Storycatch Partners mission, is it's empathy and evidence. And those two things, they're not always seen as going together. And that's part of this almost dialectic nuance that I'm trying to work into the whole ethos of Storycatch Partners. One of the things about rare disease, and one of the reasons why I have had some good business association with people in the rare disease space, including my co-founder, Jim Cavan, who had a lot of success doing observational research within the rare disease, both rheumatoid arthritis originally with one of his first companies, and then through a company that he founded where it was working with families that had children with very rare disease, where maybe there were only one or two, three, five, half a dozen in the whole world that had this same disease. And so that takes a certain amount of determination to find the patterns and the insights that you might find from an N of one, or one person being part of the trial or the research project. And so there's a lot of overlap and similarities between mental health and the challenges of collecting information about rare disease. So I'm very proud that we recently at Storycatch Partners made an acquisition of a company that has already been in business for a decade, over a decade. And it's a data and research business that has been built on doing clinical trials and observational research for poorly understood physical areas as well as rare disease. And what we are working on with them is incorporating mental health studies as part of physical studies, because as we all know, whole health means mental and physical health. And oftentimes, when I'm working with hospital systems and talking to them about their strategies, and they'll talk about whole health, and then they'll have a bucket where they'll talk about mental health, and I'll say, I thought we were talking about mental health the whole time, because there's so much crossover between somebody who is suffering from a physical ailment and how they are able to recover from that, or even how they're able to live with some of the vulnerabilities that they may have because of the physical illness. And so I really see them as very interchangeable, very applicable in terms of our business model there. Our hope with the data and research part of the business, or our plan, I should say, is that we will be able to attract people into our community and environment with the purpose of hearing other people's stories, sharing their stories, becoming more educated and informed about different areas that they want to learn about. But then they can be invited in to be part of observational research studies where they might be able to be part of something that will outlive them and help generations in the future. The way that you attract people in to do that is that you have them feel like they're part of something bigger than themselves, that it becomes meaningful. It's not just they're filling out a form for a doctor. They're not just doing it because they think that it will be only helpful to them. They understand that their participation in this research study will help others over time. And so I think that there's a lot of lessons to be learned from the business models that have been applied to rare disease in the past. And one of the things that I feel like is another commonality in working with people that have a struggle of any nature, are part of that ambiguity of being human puzzle that we all deal with, is that we all love somebody, and we all love somebody, and in loving somebody we fear that we will lose them emotionally or physically. That's a fear we all live with as being human. That can be because of mental health reasons, that can be of physical health reasons, that can be that they're perfectly healthy, but something happened, right? I think that there's a unification in all of this as well from a community perspective, that we're all helping each other through these struggles in life, and we're getting better at helping others when they struggle.
I just want to kind of reiterate some of the things that I just learned and some of the things that I believe in that you are putting forward. When I think about this cross pollination of understanding that whole health is all of the areas and shouldn't be put in a silo. And it really goes back to what we started to talk about, how you would hear about systems really kind of putting things in buckets and separate them versus let's look at the entire picture. And then when we look at the entire picture, how can we start to build on producing change? And that does involve, of course, data. We hear about that, but the storytelling and all of the other areas that are a part of that can sometimes be hard for people to really understand that that has to be a part of it. The last part that I really appreciate you highlighting, we often forget that we are just one health issue away from our whole lives turning upside down. And that one person that we love, if something happens to them mentally or physically, it shakes our world, it rocks our world. And one thing I often say is your life is your most prized possession. And having the ability to think about these areas in hopes of mitigating or reducing or having a space to process when this happens, because ultimately this happens to all of us in some sort of way, is vital when we talk about health. And that brings me to the next question. With all of the wonderful things that you are putting forward, and I can see this forecast beautifully of all the things that you're putting forward as a CEO, a mother of four, and someone involved, I'm in so many different boards. How do you manage to find the time to put this work forward, even though I know you're driven and have this internal passion that is palpable when you're speaking, but how do you do that and maintain your well-being? Because we hear the phrase, I always like to say, in order to help others, you have to put your oxygen mask on first. So tell me, how do you do that?
Thank you. And occasionally I'll be working with parents and I'll talk about self-care and they'll look at me and say, "Are you doing is it one of those situations where it's do as I say, not as I do?" I've really learned it quite a bit over the last few years because my evolution in doing this as a business really started as doing it as more because I was getting a lot of phone calls from people that would hear me speak. I did a little bit of speaking early on when my kids were not doing well, and I was in some ways outraged that I felt so alone, and I was outraged that I did not feel like I could get good care in some cases in the state where I live, and I felt like I had to go to seek out care outside of the state, and I felt like I had to pay for it when maybe it should have been covered by insurance. So I had this feeling of, why is this so hard? And I started speaking about it and telling my story in order to try and get change or to be heard. And so I started to get phone calls, and this is starting about maybe 5, 6 years ago. I would get a couple of phone calls a week that were people that I didn't know that had heard about me or were told to call me by a friend of a friend, and they would ask to talk. They felt like they had permission to tell me their story because they had heard mine. So I started to do what I'm doing somewhat now early on in that time frame, and I found I had to be very intentional about hearing the stories, offering that empathy, but being able to discharge that and look after myself. And that I found that if I ran too hard at it, gave too much of myself away, that indeed I wasn't able to be there for my family. I would start to feel a little, sometimes I think a little resentful because that's my go to feeling when I feel like I'm not able to be balanced, right? So, my first instinct, my first warning sign when I feel like I'm not quite emotionally balanced is I start to get angry at everybody who's asking me for help. And I'm like, wait a minute. That's my first sign because I'm using that sort of almost protective mechanism to say, I need more space. And that's not their problem. That's my problem. I have to set up those boundaries. So I've sort of learned some techniques over time. I do a lot of what I call forest bathing, which is a Japanese practice. And it's really just walking in the woods and just being in nature. I find that to be very soothing. I try really, really hard to protect my sleep because I have found that when I don't get good sleep, that's when I'm also not at my best. And I gave a little talk. It was kind of a TED style talk at my reunion at Harvard Business School last October. And they asked me to talk about my struggles with my kids in the mental health system. But what I really wanted to talk about was my definition of success. 30 years ago, when I graduated Harvard Business School, I thought I knew what my definition of success was. I thought it was get a great job, maybe get married and have kids, but I didn't really view that as part of success. I just thought great job, money, be a captain of industry. I was very competitive with my father, who had done very well in industry. 30 years on, I feel like some of the learnings that I've had from the experience our family has had is, what's your definition of success? There have been times where people have told me that, I'm doing a great job, my kids are lucky to have me, maybe I saved their lives, those kinds of things. And those are, people, well-meaning people. I'll quite often say, sometimes the best I can do is just look in the mirror and say, this is all I've got today and I'm going to give it. Sometimes that's all I can do. And is that success? I don't know. I think it comes down to how do you define that and how do you balance your approach to life almost on a daily basis. So I would say that self-care element is a little bit of a work in process, but I really try on the sleep, try on the getting out in nature at least once a day, and I do boxing training. So I hit a heavy bag as hard as I can 3 or 4 times a week. And I think that makes everybody else in my life really happy when I do that because I'm a much kinder and gentler person once I have all that aggression out of me.
These are fantastic tips. I'm going to repeat them because I want to illuminate them. Know your signs. I heard that you shared. You know your signs when you start to feel angry when people are asking for help. And I also loved forest bathing. Did I hear that correctly? I
Yes,
love
yes.
it where you're walking through the forest, and that's just a fantastic tip. And then, of course, I love that you said protecting your sleep, because that is something that we often forget and can lead to mental health issues as well as overall, let's just call it, instead of just saying mental health, it can lead to overall health issues, whether it's cardiovascular, mental, and so forth. And the last is, have that definition of success. We talk about action plans of things that you can do to help yourself, but having a definition that isn't always a part of that playbook of self-care, because when you do have it, it can help you kind of have that barometer and decide, where are you? What is your definition? Because you have to have a starting point to realize where you want to go or when you want to retreat. Those are great things to keep in your pocket. I'm going to memorialize those. That was fantastic. Wrapping up, I want to thank you, Samantha, for joining me today. I'm a huge advocate for overall health, and originally, most people would say mental health, but based on this conversation, I'm going to just call it overall health. It was fantastic to learn about the many angles that you are investing in to garner a bigger outcome for health down the road. I think that is the best way I can describe it. You really are reflective of when I say going beyond clinical walls, that is exactly what you're doing. I have thoroughly enjoyed our conversation and I appreciate all of the things that you're putting forward. So thank you for joining me on Beyond Clinical Walls. It has been a pleasure.
Thank you so much. This made my day, and I would love to talk to you again.
I would love to have you back. Thank you, Samantha. And as I always end each episode, I'd like to extend a level of gratitude for everyone who took the time to listen and hear this information. And as always, please pass it forward, because when you do that, you're not only helping yourself, but you're helping others.